Chapter 1. A quiet stop on the way home. Tom Hardy drove down the highway in his black SUV, his eyes focused on the road, but his mind was miles away. He had just left the set and, finally, after months of grueling work, he was escaping the frantic pace of it all. Everything had become quiet, familiar, and distant. The road was leading him home, to where he could finally feel like a person again, not a star under the spotlight. He wasn't looking for noise or bright lights. He preferred the stillness and the vastness of the natural world, something he rarely had the time to appreciate in his fast-paced life. The evening light was fading, and the sky was taking on a deep hue, but Tom was focused on the calmness of the moment, the fleeting peace of being away from the press and the rush of constant motion. The usual world, Hollywood, interviews, meetings, and deadlines, was so far behind him now that it felt like a different lifetime. As he passed by small towns and empty roadside houses, he felt like he was driving through a world he had almost forgotten. A world that had no cameras, no noise, and no rush. He pulled off the highway and turned into a small, almost forgotten gas station. It was the kind of place that didn't ask for attention, one where you could just stop and breathe for a moment. The faded neon sign flickered weakly in the evening air, casting a gentle, almost nostalgic glow. The station was nearly empty, with only a few cars scattered here and there, the stillness interrupted only by the occasional sound of a distant engine. Tom parked his SUV near the entrance, shutting off the engine with a sigh of relief. He felt a certain comfort in this anonymity, in the simplicity of it all. This wasn't the life of a movie star, it was a moment of normalcy, a tiny respite before diving back into the madness that would start again the moment he returned to work. He stepped out of the car and stretched, the weariness from a long day of filming still in his limbs. The cool California evening wrapped around him, and for a brief moment, he felt like a man rather than a figure in the tabloids. He glanced at the old photograph in his wallet, a snapshot of his wife, standing with their son, both smiling. It was a moment of pure joy, of a time when the world felt more grounded. He walked toward the store, feeling the weight of his day dissolve with each step. Inside, the old man behind the counter was reading a newspaper, absorbed in the stories of the world. It was a quiet, normal scene. A far cry from the whirlwind of his daily life, filled with premieres, interviews, and constant attention. He made his way to the coffee station and started to fill a cup, his thoughts drifting back to his family. His wife, his son, how much he missed them, and how much he longed to just be home, to be a father, a husband, not just a public figure. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, savoring the peace that filled the air. And then, in the distance, he heard the rumble of motorcycles. The sound grew louder, quickly drowning out the hum of the station. 3 massive bikes appeared, headlights cutting through the twilight, engines roaring, demanding attention. Tom instinctively straightened up, his body alert, his mind sharpening. He wasn't the type of man who ran from trouble, but he could feel it coming. These weren't just regular bikers, they were a pack, and they weren't here by accident. They circled the station, engines growling like wild animals, before parking in a row near the entrance, taking up more space than needed. Tom's eyes flicked to the leader of the group. His size, his rugged appearance, and the tattooed arms that adorned his body made it clear this wasn't a group to take lightly. The leader, a giant of a man with a scruffy beard and leather vest, stepped off his bike. His presence was almost magnetic, pulling Tom's attention even as he tried to stay calm. These weren't just men looking for a cup of coffee. No, they were looking for something else. Tom remained still, his posture relaxed but alert. He had learned over the years to read people, to sense danger before it arrived. He didn't react to the sound of their laughter or the growing tension in the air. He just watched them, waiting for the moment when their intentions would become clear. The leader's eyes locked with his for a moment, sizing him up, before he said something to his companions. They started laughing, their voices loud and mocking. They were testing him, pushing his buttons. And yet, Tom remained unmoved, his eyes unwavering. He was used to being the center of attention, but this felt different. These men weren't here to ask for an autograph. They were here to make a point. The leader stepped closer, his presence now filling the air between them. Tom could feel the heat of his words before they even left his mouth. "Looks like we've got a little Uncle Sam's toy soldier here," the leader said, his voice booming across the station, dripping with sarcasm. "What are you, some kind of hero?" Tom didn't flinch, didn't change his posture. He simply stood there, waiting for the moment to pass. He wasn't interested in engaging in this petty game. He'd been through worse. Letting people like this provoke him was exactly what they wanted, and he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he allowed them to speak, to shout their insults, knowing that the longer he stayed calm, the more frustrated they would become. He didn't need to prove anything. He wasn't here to fight. He was just here for a quiet moment of normalcy. But the longer they stayed, the more he could feel the tension building. They weren't going to leave without a fight, and Tom knew he had to be ready when the time came. Chapter 2. The Biker Arrival. The air around the station grew thicker as the motorcycles roared to a halt. The sound of their engines had been an unwelcome disturbance to the calm of the evening. But now, as the bikes came to rest in front of the store, it felt almost oppressive. Tom, still standing near the coffee station, couldn't help but notice the immediate shift in the atmosphere. The bikers, who had just parked, were now dismounting their massive motorcycles one by one, each of them towering over the quiet surroundings. The leader, a hulking figure with a scruffy beard, was the first to move, his eyes scanning the scene with purpose. The clattering of boots on the gravel was the first indication that something was about to happen. Tom's senses sharpened. He didn't flinch, but he was aware of every movement, every step that was taken. He could feel the weight of their presence like a shadow looming over the small station. The quiet station that had once felt like a haven now seemed to close in around him, suffocating in its stillness. Bear, the leader, turned toward Tom and his group, a wide grin spreading across his face, clearly seeing the opportunity to provoke. There was an air of challenge in his stance, as if this was a game of domination, and he wasn't going to let the actor stand quietly in the corner of the room. His voice, when it came, was loud and mocking, designed to get a rise. Well, Bear said, his words thick with sarcasm. Look what we got here. One of Uncle Sam's boy toys decided to grace us with his presence. What's the matter? Are you lost? The insult wasn't subtle, and neither was the energy Bear was pushing out. Tom stood tall, his expression calm, giving nothing away. He knew what these types were like, used to throwing their weight around, expecting people to bend under their scrutiny. But Tom was no stranger to being the target of other people's insecurities. He'd been in the public eye for years, and it wasn't the first time someone tried to test his limits. The other bikers, smaller but equally imposing, shuffled behind their leader, casting sideways glances at Tom, as if daring him to say something, anything, that would allow them to turn the situation into something physical. Tom knew that the longer this dragged on, the more likely it was that they would force a confrontation. The store was quiet. The old man behind the counter was still absorbed in his newspaper, his eyes flicking up every now and then, but only out of the corner of his eye. He had seen these types before, aggressive men looking for trouble, but there was no reason to get involved unless it escalated further. It was clear that Tom wasn't engaging, and that made the biker's frustration grow. Bear, not getting the immediate response he wanted, began pacing in front of Tom, clearly enjoying the tension he was creating. He spoke louder now, his words cutting through the evening air. "But you think you're some kind of hero, huh? All those rockets and fancy electric cars," Bear taunted. "Maybe you should come down from your high horse and see how the real world works. You know, the world where people like me don't put up with all that save the world crap." Tom didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and allowed the silence to stretch between them. He wasn't going to rise to the bait. This was exactly what they wanted, to get him to react, to show emotion, to give them an excuse to escalate the situation. And Tom wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. He didn't have time for petty insults. He had bigger things to worry about. His mind wandered briefly back to his family, to the quiet moment at home he was hoping to return to. He wanted to get through this without further conflict, to leave the station with nothing more than a momentary interruption. But it was clear that the bikers were determined to take this further. Bear, sensing that Tom wouldn't engage in the way he wanted, took a step closer, his shadow stretching over Tom as he leaned in with an air of intimidation. Tom's body tensed ever so slightly, but his posture remained steady. "Come on, what's the matter? You think you're above it all?" Bear's breath smelled of stale beer and cigarette smoke. "Let's see how tough you really are without all your tech toys and shiny suits." Tom stood still. He could feel the anger simmering just beneath the surface in Bear's voice, but he knew better than to respond in kind. The first rule of dealing with this kind of aggression was not to engage directly. Let them shout, let them make their threats. It only gave them the illusion of control. Tom wasn't about to play into that. He gave Bear a cool glance and responded in the calmest voice possible, one that barely carried over the noise of the station. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Tom said. If you want to keep talking, fine. But if you're looking for a fight, you'll have to find someone else." Bear paused, momentarily thrown off by Tom's lack of reaction. He wasn't used to people not being intimidated by his size or his words. It threw him off balance for a second, but only for a second. He wasn't the kind of man to back down. With a sneer, he reached for a bag of chips from the shelf and crushed it in his hand, throwing it back onto the display with deliberate force. "Maybe you should learn some manners, Snake," one of the other bikers muttered from the side, giving Tom a sharp look as he slammed a cooler door shut. He was clearly trying to get a reaction to add fuel to the fire. But Tom didn't bite. His focus remained unbroken, as if the world outside the two of them didn't exist. He was calm, calculating, like a predator who knew when to strike and when to simply wait. The tension in the air had thickened, and Tom knew that it was only a matter of time before one of them made a move. This wasn't just a verbal exchange anymore. It was becoming something else entirely. And he needed to be ready. Chapter 3. The Insults and Taunts. The atmosphere around the station had shifted from tense to volatile. The bikers weren't backing off. Instead, they were trying even harder to provoke Tom, egging him on with every word, every gesture, hoping to see some crack in his calm exterior. Bear, the leader, was relentless. His voice boomed through the station, growing louder as he continued to taunt Tom. "You think you're so special, huh? Just because you run a bunch of fancy tech companies." Bear spat, his words dripping with mockery. "What's so great about sending rockets into space and making electric cars? Maybe you should try actually living like the rest of us for a change. No fancy gadgets, no pretty suits, just real work." Tom remained silent, standing tall and still. He knew exactly what was happening. The bikers weren't interested in a rational conversation. They were trying to get under his skin, trying to push him into some sort of confrontation. But Tom had long since learned that responding to these kinds of provocations was exactly what they wanted. He wasn't about to let them control the situation. He didn't need to justify his life or his work to anyone. He didn't need to engage with their ignorance or their bitterness. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, getting through this encounter without escalating it. Snake, one of Bear's companions, wasn't giving up. He stepped forward, his face twisted with disdain as he glared at Tom. "You think you're better than us? You think you're above all of this? Maybe you need a little lesson in humility," Snake sneered, the words laced with venom. Tom felt the anger radiating off of them, but he didn't flinch. The more they shouted, the more he remained calm. His posture didn't change. His mind was clear. He was used to handling pressure, to staying composed in situations where others would lose their cool. The old man behind the counter finally glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. He'd seen enough trouble in his day to know that this wasn't going to end well if it kept going. He kept his distance, but his hand hovered near the phone, ready to call the authorities if things escalated. Bear took another step forward, closing the distance between them. He wasn't going to back down, not now, not after everything he'd said. "What's the matter, tech boy?" he continued, leaning in closer. "You too good to talk to a real man? You're just a puppet in your little billionaire world. You think anyone cares about your little toy company? You wouldn't last a minute in the real world." Tom's eyes remained locked on Bear's, his expression still calm, still unreadable. He didn't need to respond to these childish insults. It was clear that Bear wasn't looking for a conversation. He was looking for a fight. Snake, sensing that his leader was getting nowhere, added his own voice to the mix. "Yeah, maybe we should show you what real strength is, huh? You think you can just stand there and ignore us?" Tom's eyes flickered for a brief moment, just enough to notice the movement in Snake's posture, as if he was getting ready to charge. Tom's instincts were sharp. He could sense that this was about to get physical, whether he liked it or not. He wasn't about to let them get the better of him, but he wasn't going to be reckless either. "Look," Tom said finally, his voice steady and calm, his tone carrying a quiet authority. "I'm not interested in playing this game. If you want to keep yelling and posturing, fine. But don't mistake my silence for weakness." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Tom wasn't trying to provoke them, but he wasn't going to let them walk all over him, either. He wasn't afraid of confrontation, but he knew that sometimes the best way to handle aggression was with restraint. "Maybe we should teach him some respect," Spike, the third biker, muttered as he cracked his knuckles loudly for effect. The sound echoed through the store, sending a wave of tension through the air. Tom didn't move. He didn't flinch. He knew what they were trying to do. They wanted him to break, to show that they had gotten under his skin. But he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Bear wasn't done yet. He reached out suddenly, grabbing hold of Tom's jacket and pulling it roughly, as if trying to strip the American flag patch off of it. "What's this worth to you, Mr. Big Shot? You think this little piece of cloth means something?" Bear growled, yanking at the fabric. Tom's muscles tightened, but his movements remained controlled. He didn't react with anger or fear. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, using Bear's own momentum against him. With a swift and fluid motion, he twisted Bear's arm behind his back, forcing him to the ground in a controlled but decisive move. The other two bikers, Snake and Spike, rushed toward Tom, but they hadn't anticipated his speed. Tom, using Bear's arm as leverage, threw Snake off balance, sending him crashing into a display of chips. The sound of crashing bags and shuffling footsteps filled the air. Spike made a move toward Tom, but by then, Tom had already anticipated his next move. He sidestepped, using Spike's own forward momentum to send him tumbling into a shelf of energy drinks, the entire display crashing to the floor in a cascade of bottles and cans. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it was enough to leave the three bikers sprawled out on the floor, groaning and disoriented. Not a single item on the shelves had been broken, except for the chip display that Snake had crashed into. Tom stood in the center of the store, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed. Frank, the elderly clerk, watched in stunned silence. He had seen many bar fights, but this was different. This wasn't just a physical altercation. It was a demonstration of strategy and control. Tom hadn't needed to throw a punch. He hadn't needed to escalate things. He had simply handled it with the same precision that he applied to everything in his life. Tom didn't waste time. He didn't linger to watch the bikers scramble to recover. Instead, he turned and walked calmly to the counter. His movements were deliberate, businesslike, as if nothing had happened. The scene was over, and there was nothing more to be said. He paid for his coffee, gave a nod of thanks to Frank, and left the store without looking back. The bikers, still on the floor, were left to pick up the pieces of their own pride. They had underestimated Tom, and it was a mistake they wouldn't make again. Chapter 4: The Turning Point. The store was once again calm. The only sounds now were the soft hum of the cooler and the occasional rustling of paper from the clerk behind the counter. The three bikers lay on the floor, stunned and trying to regain their bearings. None of them had expected this. They had come to provoke, to assert their dominance, but they had been the ones who were humbled. It was as if the world had shifted under their feet, and now they were grappling with the fact that their expectations had been completely shattered. Bear, still groaning on the floor, tried to push himself up, but the pain in his arm was too much. He glanced around at his two companions, who were also slowly picking themselves up, rubbing their heads, or looking at their battered bodies. Their pride was bruised, their egos shattered, but what hurt the most was the realization that they had just been outclassed by someone they had hoped to intimidate. They had underestimated him. Tom was gone. He had done what he came to do, and now he was leaving, as calm and composed as he had arrived. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't thrown a single punch. He had simply used their aggression against them, neutralizing them with a precision that left them no room to recover. The lesson was clear: violence wasn't about strength. It was about control, about knowing when to act and how to use the energy around you to your advantage. The bikers didn't know how to process it. Their usual bravado had been demolished in seconds, and now they were left to pick up the pieces of their pride. Snake, still clutching his wrist where Tom had locked him in a hold, cursed under his breath. He had never been put in a position like this before. He was used to pushing people around, using his strength and intimidation to get what he wanted. But Tom had taken all of that from him in the blink of an eye. His hand shook slightly as he tried to adjust his jacket. Spike, who had been knocked into the energy drinks, stood up slowly, rubbing his neck where he had collided with the shelf. He was shaken, but more than that, he was confused. They had come here expecting an easy target, but now they were questioning everything. Were they really as tough as they thought they were? Had they really dominated everyone they met? Or had they simply been lucky until now? Frank, the elderly clerk, stood behind the counter, watching the bikers silently. He had seen a lot of things in his day, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight. It was a lesson in restraint and strategy. Tom had handled the situation with the precision of a professional, and it was clear to Frank that the bikers would never forget this night. "They don't make him like that anymore," Frank muttered to himself as he wiped down the counter. He had seen the video play out in real time, but now he was processing the full weight of what had happened. What Tom had done wasn't just physical, it was a statement. A quiet statement that said, I don't need to fight. I don't need to prove anything. But if you push me, I'll handle it my way, and I'll do it better than you." The sirens of a police car could be heard in the distance, growing louder as it approached the station. Frank, still in awe of Tom's control, didn't move. He had already seen the bikers' humiliation play out, but he wasn't about to let them turn the situation into something bigger than it was. The cops would handle the rest, and Frank knew that Tom was long gone by now. The bikers' time was up. When the police finally arrived, two officers stepped out of the car. One was Officer Sarah Martinez, a seasoned cop who had seen it all over her 15 years on the force. Her eyes quickly scanned the scene, taking in the three bikers, still on the floor, groaning, and the calm figure of Tom, who had already left the building. Evening, Tom had greeted her as she entered the store, his tone polite and almost too calm. "I apologize for the disturbance." The officers looked over at the bikers, who were now struggling to get up, their faces contorted with frustration. Officer Martinez raised an eyebrow but didn't speak right away. Instead, she surveyed the scene, taking in the evidence with the calm professionalism of someone who had dealt with this kind of thing before. "Sir," she finally said, turning to the bikers, "we're going to need you to sit tight. We'll take your statements in a moment." Bear, clearly humiliated, made an attempt to rise, but his body betrayed him. He struggled, clenching his fist in anger. He was the one who had started this, the one who had been the loudest and most confident, and now he was the one who looked the weakest. Snake, meanwhile, seemed more concerned with the damage to his wrist than anything else. His mind raced through the possibilities. What would happen now? How could he explain this? And Spike? He was still standing in a daze, his pride in pieces. Officer Martinez, who had witnessed it all, didn't seem overly concerned with the bikers' reactions. She had already seen the security footage, and she knew that this wasn't a situation where the bikers would be able to spin their story into a victory. "Let me see the footage," Martinez said, turning to Frank. The clerk handed her his phone, and she studied the video with a quiet intensity. As she watched the footage, her expression shifted from concern to admiration. There was no violence in Tom's actions, only control, only calculated precision. She couldn't help but respect that. "This is textbook," one of the other officers muttered as he reviewed the footage. "That's how you handle multiple attackers." When Martinez was done reviewing the footage, she turned back to the bikers, who were now sitting on the curb, looking defeated. "You three are lucky this didn't go any further," she said, her voice firm. "But based on the footage and witness statements, this was clearly self-defense. You'll still be taken into custody, though. We've got charges to process." Bear, his pride wounded and his ego bruised, made a final attempt to salvage the situation. "We want to press charges," he growled, but his voice lacked the force it had earlier. Martinez didn't even flinch. "Based on what I see here," she said, pointing to the footage, "you're the ones who threw the first punch. Bringing a weapon into this makes it a whole different ball game." The situation was quickly defusing, and the bikers, who had once thought they were in control, now realized that they were the ones at the mercy of the law. As the officers took their statements and prepared to transport them to the station, the bikers were left to reflect on their failed attempt to dominate the situation. Meanwhile, Tom had long since left the scene. He had done what needed to be done and left, just as calmly as he had arrived. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed it. As Tom pulled out of the station and onto the road, he allowed himself a small smile. The evening had been delayed, but it didn't matter. He was going home, and that was all that mattered now. The bikers, meanwhile, were left to face the consequences of their actions. They had learned the hard way that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one throwing punches, but the one who knows how to stay calm and let the situation resolve itself. In the end, it wasn't about strength. It was about control, and Tom Hardy had shown them exactly how to maintain it. Chapter 5: Resolution and Recognition. By the time the police arrived, the tension in the air had dissipated, replaced by the uneasy stillness of a situation that had just been defused. The bikers, who had once seemed so sure of themselves, were now gathered at the curb, nursing their wounded egos and struggling to regain their composure. They had no idea what had hit them. The events of the last few minutes had left them reeling, their bodies aching from the quick and calculated strikes that had sent them crashing to the ground. Bear, still nursing his arm, shot a glance at his companions, but there was no defiance left in his eyes. He knew that this was over, and they had lost. His pride had taken the hardest blow, and it was clear that whatever happened next, they wouldn't be walking away from this with their heads held high. The police officers took their time processing the scene, as Officer Martinez reviewed the security footage on Frank's phone. The footage was clear, and the sequence of events was undeniable. Tom had handled the situation with cold precision. He hadn't thrown punches, hadn't escalated things into a full-blown brawl. Instead, he had neutralized the threat with calm control, never letting his emotions dictate his actions. Martinez raised an eyebrow as she watched the video. There was something striking about Tom's response to the bikers. His movements were fluid, almost graceful, as he disarmed their aggression with effortless ease. This wasn't a fight. It was a calculated strategy, the kind of strategy she had seen in military personnel or seasoned negotiators. But here it was, executed by someone who wasn't a soldier or a cop, just a man who knew exactly how to stay calm under pressure. "He's something else," she muttered, still watching the footage. No unnecessary force, just pure control. She turned to Frank, who was standing by, his arms folded across his chest, a bemused smile on his face. "You're telling me this guy's a movie star?" she asked, still processing what she had just seen. "I've never seen anything like it." Frank chuckled. "You don't make it to the top in Hollywood if you don't know how to stay cool under pressure. I guess he doesn't just act the part. He lives it." Martinez nodded, still absorbing the lesson in self-control that Tom had imparted without saying a word. She turned back to the bikers, who were now sitting in silence, their earlier bravado gone, replaced by a quiet realization that they had seriously misjudged the situation. They had picked the wrong fight, and they had lost. As the officers moved in to take their statements, Bear, looking defeated, finally spoke up, though his voice was weak. "We want to press charges," he muttered, still in disbelief over how quickly everything had gone sideways. Officer Thompson, who had been standing off to the side, took one look at Bear and shook his head. "Are you serious? You started this mess. You're lucky it didn't get worse." He pointed to the security footage. "The video clearly shows you through the first punch. You came here looking for trouble, and now it's catching up with you." Bear's face flushed with embarrassment as he realized the full scope of his mistake. There was no way to spin the situation in their favor. He had underestimated Tom, and now they were all paying the price for it. Meanwhile, the story of what had happened at the gas station began to spread. Word quickly made its way through social media, and before long, the footage of the altercation had gone viral. People were captivated by the way Tom had handled the situation, how he had turned the bikers' aggression against them without raising a fist. He wasn't just a Hollywood star. To the public, he had become something more, an example of calm, calculated strength in a world where chaos seemed to reign. At the local police station, Detective Roberts, who had been handling the case, couldn't help but chuckle as he watched the footage. "Well, that's one way to do it," he said, impressed by Tom's ability to subdue the bikers without breaking a sweat. "We can learn a lot from that. It's textbook control. No violence, no escalation, just precision." As the night wore on, the bikers were processed and taken into custody, each facing their own set of charges. Bear, who had a lengthy criminal record, would face the most severe consequences. But the real story wasn't about the bikers. It was about how Tom had handled the entire situation. And that story was already being shared far and wide. Back at Wilson's gas station, Frank continued to replay the security footage for customers, each of them wide-eyed and amazed at the calmness Tom had displayed. "See that move right there?" Frank said proudly to one of his regulars, pointing at the screen. "That's how you do it." He didn't throw any punches, didn't even raise his voice. Just pure efficiency. The customers gathered around, their eyes glued to the screen. The story had already made its way to local veterans groups, and soon enough, word had spread throughout the community. Everyone was talking about how Tom had defused a potentially violent situation with nothing more than his calm demeanor and quick thinking. In the coming days, the story reached even further. News outlets picked it up, and interviews with Frank were being aired on local television. Everyone wanted to hear about the man who had handled the bikers with such grace and control. Some were calling him a hero. Others simply admired his ability to stay composed in the face of danger. As for the bikers, their reputation in the local community was tarnished. The Road Devils NC patch they had worn so proudly now sat in evidence bags, a reminder of their failed attempt to assert dominance. The president of their club, furious at the way his members had behaved, expelled them from the group by unanimous vote. They had dishonored not only themselves, but the very principles they had once stood for. Back at Tom's house, the evening had finally settled into the warmth of family. He arrived home later than expected, but that didn't matter. His son, XA, 12, who had been waiting up for him, ran toward him the moment he stepped through the door. "Daddy!" XA, 12 screamed, launching himself into Tom's arms. Grimes, his wife, appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears of joy. The chaos of the evening felt distant now, like a brief interruption in an otherwise ordinary life. Tom held his son close, planting a kiss on Grimes's forehead. She had been worried, but now, seeing him home safe, she relaxed. XA, 12 reached up and touched the American flag patch on Tom's jacket, the very same patch that had been disrespected by Bear earlier in the evening. "My daddy's a hero," the boy said with pride, his voice full of innocence and love. Tom smiled, his heart full. In that moment, he felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. He wasn't just a movie star. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a father, a husband, someone who had fought for what mattered and, in the end, come out on top. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer Martinez had already added the security footage to her training materials, planning to use it as an example of how to handle dangerous situations with minimal force. It wasn't just a fight. It was a lesson in restraint, leadership, and control. In the end, Tom's calm was his greatest weapon, and the world had taken notice.
If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us and motivates us to continue sharing heartwarming, inspiring stories almost every day.